Thank you for joining me, Merrill, today. You're a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation.
Mm-hmm.
You're the past president of the Health Economics Roundtable for the National Association for Business Economics,
Mm-hmm.
plus a medical ethicist.
Ethicist, yes.
Yeah, that's a difficult word for us here, because we don't have this with the ethics. But for the University of Texas and at the Southwestern Medical Center
Mm-hmm.
International. So, well, thank you for joining me. We have just had the Free Market Roadshow stop successfully conducted in Dallas this year, and with a variety of topics that were covered. Thank you for doing that with us. But let me get started right away. You do write. You do write a lot. So what made you become a writer?
Years and years ago, back in the 1970s, when I was going to seminary, I would travel home, and I had to go from Fort Worth to Dallas, and I started listening to talk shows. And when I was listening to talk shows, people came on there, and they would talk a bit about their impression of things or what was happening in the country and so forth. And even though my undergraduate degree was in economics, this was sort of my first effort at listening to real interplay between the economy, politics, culture, and all of those things. And so I got to thinking, if the time comes, I'd really like to get engaged in that. And eventually the time came where it was kind of a convoluted trip there, but I get to guest host the longest running radio talk show in the country now. It has 220 stations. It's been going for 52 years. So occasionally I'm in there guest hosting that, and so that's fun. And then I get to write, I'm a columnist for The Hill, which is in Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
and I have a column that appears every Tuesday there, and I get to write about just anything I really want to. And
that's a privilege.
There's 5 of us who do that, and it's sometimes on policy, sometimes on politics, but because of the focus here at Institute for Policy Innovation, it's almost always about policy, not so much culture occasionally, but generally more economics, public policy, politics, and that interplay there.
Well, on the way here, we were talking a little bit about politics and about Trump, and you once wrote in 2023 that Ronald Reagan is a good model for the GOP candidates to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So the Republican Party was once the socially conservative, economically new liberal party.
Right.
And it seems that this is no longer the case. So what has happened? What are the consequences? Where has the good old cop gone?
It's a good question, because I think the one word answer as to what has happened to the Republican Party is Trump. Mm-hmm. Because even though you had people who were generally of the legacy of Ronald Reagan in the 2016 election, and that would have been Jeb Bush and some of those. Jeb Bush was, I would argue, more conservative than his brother, George W. Bush, and more politically and policy astute. Yeah. And you had some people who were sort of in the Reaganite mold in this past one. Mike Pence, if you were a traditional conservative or you were a cultural conservative, Mike Pence should have been your candidate in 2024, and he couldn't get any attention in anything. So Trump has been the primary factor that has really changed the Republican Party. It's really not the Reagan Party anymore. It's the Trump Party, and it's significantly different.
And it's also been a long way since the Tea Party started out, so they are gone. The Tea Party is gone.
It's interesting, because the Tea Party, when it started up in response to Barack Obama primarily, and they really wanted to get people to move more towards conservative policy. And then I saw so many of the Tea Party people be the first adopters of Trump. And I was surprised by this, because Trump is not a conservative. He's just not. He does some conservative things, but he really doesn't operate off a philosophy of limited government, low taxes, strong national defense. That's not him. He operates off what just sort of feels good to him at this particular time.
So, according to a report by the Voter Study Group, only 22% of the electorate would fit into the socially conservative, economically neoliberal category. if these percentages are correct, then the Republican Party can no longer run as a fusionist of conservatism.
Those numbers strike me as a little low, but I wouldn't suspect they'd be too low right now. Just what we see when we go through and talk to groups, various Republican groups and others, there is an abandonment of the traditional conservative/libertarian approach to government, to taxes. Nobody's talking. Trump lowered taxes in 2017. That was a very good policy. But we're not talking about that. In fact, Trump's talking about raising taxes. That is tariffs.
Yeah.
10% tariff on every import. That's a tax. Nobody's talking about controlling government spending. That used to be something that used to be a bedrock of conservative/Republican. Nobody's taking that approach right now. So it's concerning because those are some of our biggest, and even addressing entitlement policies.
Yeah.
We've become a very bloated welfare state,
Yeah.
and nobody's talking about trying to get that under control.
Well, when we went to your office here, we saw all those Reagan pictures and documents. And so what has happened to those values that Reagan has kind of defended, this neoliberal, classical economic free market approach?
There's still a group that support that. They go by the name Freedom Conservatives. And that's as opposed to the other group, which is called the National Conservatives. They call them NatCons, Free Cons versus NatCons. NatCons, I think, are by and large winning because that has got most of the public right now. And so, and the base has transitioned. And it's even interesting how the transition, Republicans used to be very pro-business. Not that you agreed with everything business did, but you wanted business to try to be able to operate freely and create jobs and so forth. Republicans have become, in many cases, very anti-business, anti-chamber of commerce, and pro-regulation. So the parties are the parties are switching. You know, we've seen this back after the Civil War. Republicans were considered radical liberals, and the Democrats were considered conservatives.
Yeah.
Early 1900s, that changed. It may be changing again.
Well, let's hope that it will change for the better, for a free society. When we're here in the guns up state, in the free state of Texas, that has always cherished independence and
it's worked for us. We've had so many people from from California, New York, Illinois, and others moving to Texas that the projections are that we'll gain 4 congressional seats in the next census, which is in 2030. We gained 3 in the last census in 2020, and I think we gained 4 in the one before that in 2010. So, and California is slated to start losing congressional seats because so many people are leaving.
But aren't you afraid that, if all those Californians are now coming to Texas, that they will still vote for the party that they voted in California for, and they left this party?
It is a real concern. Our general sense is if they're coming from California and they still like those policies, they're moving to Austin.
Okay.
But if they're coming to Dallas, or maybe going to Houston, but if they're coming to Dallas, they're generally going to be on the more conservative side. And there was an economist at SMU who looked at this, and he thinks that by and large they haven't been bringing their policies. They've been bringing their household goods, but not so much their policies. And maybe some of them have learned a lesson.
Well, let's hope so. Let's switch gears again a little bit and then come back to your Hills article. And you once mentioned Ross Perot, a candidate who resembled Trump and ran on a populist platform. And it seems that the populist appeal just has been present for a couple of decades now, and it's everywhere. We see that in Europe, but we see that in the US even more so.
Right.
Is this a revolution or what is it?
When Ross Perot ran in 1990, his first time was 1992. That's when he was able to gain 19% of the vote. And he was something of a populist. Interestingly, I would argue that both the primary presidential candidates now, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, have become populist. They're both looking out there asking the question, what pleases the party, what pleases people most, and that's going to be my policy. And I did a piece here about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, just looking at 1 week in Joe Biden's life, because every day he was going out to various places saying, we're providing $34 billion for a year to do this. And he was going to generally red states or places, voters that he would not be considered to have that strong an appeal to, and not talking about all the money he's giving away. Now, this is taxpayer money. And yet he's going out, and this was 1 week. I think I had in there 5 different announcements that he made of money he's trying to give away. It's a very populist appeal. Vote for me because I will get money to you.
Yeah, well, we know that. That's Jim Buchanan, public choice theory, and that's what we've been working on all the time.
And the old principles conservatives that we would have with George W. Bush and earlier Reagan primarily, and to some extent the others, that principled part just seems to be gone. Both parties have moved to populism.
Yeah. Well, there is a last question that I have for you.
Okay.
In an article titled "Isolationism isn't a U.S. option," so you argue that it would be reckless to almost impossible for the U.S. to embrace isolationism. According to a series of polls by Morning Consult, around 42% of Americans are in favor of isolationism, 20% favor engagement, and around 30% in favor of stability. So how would you argue this with advocating for isolationism?
Right. What's happened is that the Trump element, less so with the Democrats and Biden, but among the Trump people, there's this isolationist move, which used to be Republican. Back in the early 1900s, Republicans were very isolationist. So there's been a change that we went more internationalist to an extent after World War II, where we said, we're the largest economy, we're the defenders of the free world, we have to be engaged economically and politically with all the other countries. Trump is trying to pull that out, but because of supply chains, because of communications that just, during our revolution, you could be somewhat isolationist because it took people 3 months to sort of get an army, get them across the sea. Yeah. Now you can have bombs over here in the matter of minutes, if not hours. So we have to stay engaged, and we have to stay working with countries that we can work with. It's really not an option that we can separate ourselves simply because the economies are so intertwined, both economically, politically, and culturally, that it's just not an option. Isolationism just really isn't an option, even if you'd like to.
Yeah, so it's open borders in terms of trade and collaboration, as the good old Austrian school tells us to do, division of labor.
That doesn't mean that you're as one of the things Biden is wanting to do is have various governments get together and sort of coordinate policies and so forth. Not that. We want the competition, tax competition. Yes. We want all that competition going on. But we cannot live in the world by ourselves, and we've got so many, politically, if you try to begin pulling away from any group, we've got so many populations, ethnic populations in the U.S. that they begin to push back, as we see with the Gaza issue and Israel. You've got populations in the United States that push and put political pressure. So it's just really hard to be isolationist these days.
Well, thank you very much, Merrill, for this insights, and especially also for your prolific writing that you have done over the years. And we are looking forward to reading many, many more of your articles and op-eds and programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.